noticed an increased appetite for videos, articles, and forum threads discussing lost media lately, and while I agree it's an important topic, it got me thinking about video games that aren't so much lost as they are stranded in the past. Acclaimed video game developer Hideo Kojima recently tweeted, "It was the dawn of the game industry when I entered the industry. Games were disposable toys. In this environment, I hope to create games that would be supported for 50 years, just like classic movies. However, unlike movies, software, hardware, and tastes have a short lifespan. Even if the images and objects survive, they cannot be played. And while I'm sure there are many great, memorable films that have been lost to time, I think Kojima is correct to point out that video games are unique in how they find themselves confined from newer and curious audiences compared to most other media. If you're a diehard cinema fan, there are plenty of options for exploring old or obscure films through things like the Criterion Channel, or the endless streaming services available, or heck, even YouTube depending on the movie. But if you're looking to experience older, more obscure video games, unless you emulate, which isn't always viable depending on the game or console generation, or hold on to every console you've owned over the years and seek out a copy on the used market, which can be absurdly expensive, your ability to experience them is effectively limited to reading about them or watching Let's Plays, which, while fine, aren't really how games were meant to be experienced. So if you don't have hundreds of dollars to drop on a whim, or were simply born too late to check these games out when they debuted, you have to hope the game you want to check out either sold well enough on their initial platform to justify a remaster, or at the very least, a port to the digital store of a console you currently own. Which wouldn't be so bad if console generations went at the same rate as home video formats. But given how much faster the gaming industry moves on, it can only be 10, 15 years before a game goes from being common and obtainable to expensive, rare, and out of reach for most people. There's a good chance, if a game was fairly popular during its initial release, that it's been ported to newer consoles somewhere in the past 7 to 10 years. But what about the great games that didn't shatter records or sell enough to get that modern day re release? What about Gitaroo Man? Alright, so for those of us not in the know, Gitaroo Man is an action rhythm game released 21 years ago, in the early days of the PS2.
And I specifically say action because while Guitar Man checks off all the boxes of being a rhythm game, its gameplay involves mechanics you would normally expect to see in fighting games.
Instead of simply surviving to the end of the song or going for the high score, your task is to deplete the enemy's life bar before they deplete yours. Songs consist of multiple phases where you'll dodge, attack, or even recharge some of your health to regain the offensive, going until the outro is initiated, at which point you get to solo the enemy into oblivion. For every note you hit on your turn, the enemy's health depletes. Miss a dodge or flub a note in your attack, and your health depletes, lending gameplay a real sense of moment-to-moment action. There's also provided replay value in story mode where, for some boss fights, additional sections of a song will play if you aren't lowering the boss's health fast enough, while those sections will be skipped entirely if you're doing really well. It's a unique system applied in just the right way to a genre that was already fun on its own, while still managing to mesh well with the quirky story of the game. In Guitar Man's story, you take the role of U1, a beautiful loser who is down on his luck with the girl of his dreams, and yearns to win her affection through the glorious power of skateboarding. Except he kinda sucks at it. Upon being ambushed by an axe-wielding demon, U1 learns that he's the distant ancestor of an alien civilization's legendary hero, Gitaroo Man. From there, he and his talking dog Puma embark on a star-spanning adventure, facing off against the alien civilization's de facto dictator, Zoe, with a W-I-E, and his numerous henchmen from planet Gitaroo. It's a simple coming-of-age story with a gargantuan heart that hardly relies on convention to tell itself. I mean, in what other game are you going to face a techno-dancing UFO that looks like a hamburger swallowed a disco ball, and a reggae-spinning shark robot on the surface of a mechanical moon? Or better yet, when was the last time you fought a trumpet-wielding bumblebee in the midst of an enchanted forest in the same game as a character named Gregorio Siegfried Wilhelm III who plays goth metal on a pipe organ, and neither felt out of place? Yeah, exactly. But Guitar Man doesn't sacrifice substance for style. While backgrounds work as music video-like imagery to accompany the battle, they also serve as secondary cutscenes that impact the mechanics of the stage or heighten the stakes of the match. Your goal isn't to just beat Flying O to get to the next stage, but to rescue the city from being forced to dance themselves to death. We don't just play the legendary theme on the acoustic because it's an amazing song, but because we're trying to help U1 get some.
Oh, yeah!
My personal favorite example of this is the intro to Born to Be Bone, which is played entirely by Sandbone Trio. Not only is it a cool percussive solo, but it restricts you to pure defense the entire time. And I remember it being something of a difficulty spike the first few times around, since you're required to dodge a flurry of attacks with fairly low health for longer than a typical dodge section requires. Beyond being a brief challenge that forces you to nail down your dodge skills, it also showcases a moment where U1 has to manage a situation as U1 without the powers of a mythical hero he only recently knew he had. It's after this stage in the game that U1 stops whining about being dragged along for the journey and begins to take his role more seriously. This pays off later when you're playing the legendary theme in Zoe's Mega Stadium, and the tone of the music mixed with the moment cause you to reflect on how far U1 has come since the beginning of the game, when he was just some anxious, awkward kid. Now he's winning over the hearts of a crowd who had just been cheering for his defeat moments earlier. In contrast to the intro of Born to Be Bone, the legendary theme is played entirely in attack, meaning there's no counter melody for you to dodge to. It's just a solo piece for a character that's finally accepted himself. As someone who was a bit of a beautiful loser himself growing up, U1's journey always resonated with me on a deeper level because of this moment. Even down to the way U1's name is displayed, which is a play on the common Japanese boy's name, Yuichi, the developers admit that they styled it unconventionally to show how U1 goes out of his way to do things that make him seem nonconformist and cool, because in reality, he knows he's not. I think most of us can relate to doing these things as an awkward preteen to elevate our coolness as a way of distracting from our excess lameness. At least, I know I can. And while fake it till you make it probably works for some people, for many of us it just doesn't. Which makes the moment all the more impactful when U1 is about to face off against Zoe, and after enduring a slew of insults, awakens the true power of the legendary hero. Having finally seen himself as a person deserving of dignity and respect, U1 activates a power unlike anything he's had before, because it was never about giving oneself a cool name to live by, but to live truly by one's own name. This is further evidenced in the appearance of Gitaroo Man's final form, which is distinctly more organic and divine compared to Zoe's boisterous, artificial suit of armor. And upon returning home, U1 retains the confidence and maturity from his time as Gitaroo Man, even though that journey is over. Almost to suggest to everyone playing that our superpower doesn't come from a suit of armor or a costume we put over our name, but from our ability to truly and unconditionally respect ourselves for who we are, blemishes and all. The rest will follow. For a game so unabashedly offbeat in its approach, Gitaroo Man is balanced by an impressive knack for knowing how and when to be sincere. And at about an hour-long playtime for the story, the whole experience ends up feeling like sitting down to watch a cozy, interactive movie, especially with how cinematic this game wound up being. Seriously, there's a CG cutscene between every level in this game, and they still look pretty damn nice, even by today's standards. I can't think of any other rhythm games from this era that devoted this much attention to its cutscenes, but I'm open to being proven wrong. Even still, Gitaroo Man makes good on everything you'd expect from a great rhythm game. Its soundtrack is catchy, gameplay is challenging, and there's not a moment on screen that fails to attract your eyes. Even down to the box art, this game's style never stops going hard. And for good reason. Its design was led by Japanese pop artist and poet Mitsuru Nakamura, otherwise known as 326, whose range of work covers both the colorful kawaii and borderline abstract. Nakamura's style is so integral to what makes Gitaroo Man great that it's hard to imagine the game looking any different and still working as well as it does. Like, did every head accessory in the game really need their own autonomous facial expressions? The answer is a resounding yes, because it wouldn't be Gitaroo Man without them. And alongside his personal work, Nakamura is also known for including short verses or poems to accompany his art, so story cutscenes in Gitaroo Man are separated by brief illustrations that, while comedic in tone, often contain thoughtful little nuggets of wisdom that reinforce part of the game's message. Apparently, in the Japanese version, upon collecting every item in the game, one of these messages will appear from Nakamura himself, congratulating the player and suggesting that maybe their time would have been better spent studying or going outside. What a legend. But it's flourishes like these that suggest just how much everyone involved in this game not only loved what they were doing, but got to include something of themselves in their work, which went a long way in making Gitaroo Man an experience all its own. Critics at the time agreed, with one remarking, "The hilariously bizarre scenarios are wonderfully conceived and drawn, with each stage playing out like some futuristic rock opera from the fruity side of the Japanese aesthetic." Wait, what the fuck? 2002, man. Don't let anybody tell you different. Alright, so for some context, it might be helpful to discuss what the scene looked like leading up to the development of Gitaroo Man. And I'll just be upfront and say I'm nowhere near an expert on the Japanese game industry circa mid to late 90s, and while I did my fair bit of research for this section, it's by no means exhaustive. With that said, until around the mid 90s, rhythm games as a genre were basically non existent. And sure, if we're being nitpicky, some might argue that there were a few rhythm style games out there, one being in the late 80s with Human Entertainment's, yes, that Human Entertainment's, Dance Aerobics on the NES, which required a power mat to play and featured stages based around different aerobics routines that players needed to mimic in order to press the appropriate buttons in time. But Dance Aerobics was arguably more a means for Bandai to sell NES peripherals, with gameplay having more to do with exercise than music, making it hard to seriously call it the first rhythm game. All of which is to say, the concept of rhythm games as they're known today is unquestionably owed to 1996's Parappa the Rapper.
You gotta do what? I gotta believe!
Released on the PS1, Parappa's gameplay is based around, well, rapping, and follows the story of a paper-thin dog who's in love with a flower. You help Parappa learn karate, how to drive a car, and how to bake a cake, all through the panty-soaking power of rap. In each stage, different buttons on the controller will appear on screen that you press in time with the music to make Parappa rap. He'll do better or worse depending on how well you can keep to the rhythm of the song, and whether you press the buttons in the correct order that they appear. Designed by musician and lead composer of the Japanese prog pop band, Size, Masaya Matsuura set out to give players a sense of joint ownership by taking part in the musical expression, or essentially, to give you that rush of playing music in a band, even if you've never played an instrument a day in your life. The game's story was mostly crafted around the art being produced by American artist Rodney Greenblatt, rather than the usual other way around, and if anything, the loose, almost improvisational story lended to the game's overall charm. But over the course of its 3-year development, Matsuura's team struggled with how to market Parappa, given there were no other games like it at the time. Some of the developers, and even Matsuura himself, wondered if what they had even was a video game. But thankfully, players disagreed and Parappa became an immediate success, spawning a guitar-based spin-off, a sequel on the PlayStation 2, and most importantly, the core template for what would distinguish rhythm games as a genre from then on. And it's clear, based on releases following Parappa, that its success led to a surge of rhythm games being developed year after year for the next decade and a half, all built, in some way, around the same mechanics as Parappa. In fact, Keiichi Yano, lead programmer for Gitaroo Man, cites Parappa the Rapper as being a major inspiration in his decision to pursue a career in game development. So that's pretty wild, right? He actually co-founded game studio Innis, short for Infinite Noise of the Inner Soul, obviously, in February 1997, not even 2 months following the Japanese release of Parappa the Rapper. Over the next 3 years, Innis would develop music and educational software with the long-term goal of developing a video game. At the time, the company was comprised of just Keiichi Yano, his wife, her brother, and one other artist, significantly limiting their ability to work on anything substantial. That was until Koei, a company who, at that point, hadn't achieved mainstream success with their games, but remained solvent through a cult following of their historic simulation titles, decided to give music games another shot. They'd attempted to break into the realm of music games back in 1990 with Band-kun on the PC, where you manage the life of an aspiring musician, sourcing bandmates and working part-time jobs, while performing shows and rocking your way to stardom. It was a fairly novel concept for its time, ultimately brought down by requiring that players buy a 30,000 yen MIDI keyboard to play the performance sections of the game. Players couldn't justify the price point for what was being offered, and the game faded into obscurity soon thereafter. It wasn't until they saw the success of rhythm games on the PlayStation that Koei thought it worthwhile to give music games another shot. So, when their media division, typically involved in strategy guides, OVAs, and music CDs, received a pitch from Innis for Gitaroo Man, they went for it. Innis already had a working relationship with Koei developing other projects, so it makes sense that the two companies saw a mutual benefit in working on the title together. Koei would provide the funding and staff from their audio department, and Innis would handle the development. Keiichi Yano had previously earned a degree in jazz studies at the University of Southern California, in addition to playing the saxophone for close to 20 years, making him a solid candidate to lead programming alongside director Yukio Shimomura, whose vision for the project would ultimately go on to play a big part in Gitaroo Man's timeless appeal. According to Keiichi Yano, the idea for Gitaroo Man came sometime in 1999 after he saw a scene in the 1986 film Crossroads, in which legendary guitarist Steve Vai faces off against the devil in a battle of guitars. Being familiar with improv from his years of playing and studying jazz, the concept of battling between instruments struck him as an interesting basis for a music game. He felt that his studio had achieved the technical skill necessary to take on game development, but he wanted to take the concept of music games and expand them in a new direction. In his 2010 interview with Edge magazine, he says, "Games like Parappa and Beatmania were focused on the rhythm, but I wanted to create a game that focused on the melody of songs, because I think you recognize a song that you like more by its melodies and harmonies than its rhythms. And since we wanted to tell a passionate story, I think that the inherent short story that is told through a good melody fits well with that." So Yano and the staff at Innis set out to craft gameplay around melodic call and response patterns. And much like with the development of Parappa, they were treading completely new ground. Initially, they struggled to strike a balance between gameplay and that revolutionary formula they were looking for, but they eventually managed to get a working prototype that everyone was satisfied with, despite major differences from the demo they had initially pitched to Koei. In total, they only had a team of 15 people covering everything from programming, sound production, and art. To say they were being ambitious would be putting it lightly. When they were late on deadlines, Koei would send staff to Innis's office to ensure the team was working diligently, sometimes sticking around until the early hours of the morning, just to make sure the staff at Innis would do the same. It sounds pretty grueling, but given how Koei's previous venture into music games went, the fact that this was Innis's first time developing a console game, it doesn't exactly surprise me that Koei wanted strict oversight on the project, which is likely why they put a member of their audio division, Yukio Shimomura, in the director's seat. As mentioned in an interview in the Gitaroo Man official guide, Shimomura aimed to make a rhythm game that exemplified a fusion of analog and digital. Now, it's beyond the scope of this video to get into the specifics of media formats and their history up through the 80s and 90s, but I think it's fair to say the 90s were something of a threshold in the mainstream, when analog cassette tapes were gradually phased out by digital CDs as the preferred listening format for music. Especially by the late 90s, as CDs became more affordable to the general public, it was abundantly clear that analog was on its way out and digital was the form of the future. Given that they were developing a rhythm game, Shimomura was clever to borrow a dichotomy typically applied to music as a foundation for the game's design. But developing video games is an inherently digital process, so what would merging it with analog even mean? Well, with 3D game development having been around for almost a decade at that point, it had become significantly easier to find CG illustrators to work on games, so much so that it was kind of the expected way to go. But rather than do that, they wanted the art for Gitaroo Man to be led by someone who exclusively worked in 2D illustration, whose work could be translated into 3D models while retaining a hand-drawn look. They also wanted someone with a name that could bring recognition to the game, along with an original, memorable style. So they reached out to 326, Mitsuru Nakamura, who was a popular artist in Japan at the time, having recently led the art on an ad campaign for Japanese broadcasting network TBS. He had got his start a few years prior designing merch and directing music videos for his friends in the folk pop band 19, making him a great fit for designing characters based around music genres, especially given his colorful style. As luck would have it, Nakamura was eager to accept the job, being a fan of video games himself and thrilled at the idea of seeing his original 2D characters moving in 3D for the first time. From the sounds of it, his work exceeded expectations, with many of his initial ideas making it into the final game, while others needed scaling down simply because their designs were too intricate to move properly in 3D. But even he admits it was hard work. In an interview prior to the game's release, he recalls working on designs at 24-hour restaurants and being interrupted by the rising sun coming in through the windows after working all night. And because they had such a small team, development meetings would involve everyone on the project and last several hours, with each person around the table being expected to discuss what they were working on. Despite that, Nakamura looks back on the process fondly, feeling that he was only able to work as hard as he did because of all the fun everyone had with it. According to Yano, we would have long brainstorming sessions where we would listen to tons of music and pick up things we liked. Sometimes when we picked songs, we also talked about the story and the kind of characters that could be bosses for that song. One was based on the name of a very famous saxophonist, David Sanborn, and voila, the Sanbone Trio was born. In Japanese, the pronunciation is the same for Sanborn and Sanbone, which means 3 bones. Speaking of music, how have I gotten this far in a video about a music game and not mentioned the people who composed for it? Alright, so true to Shimomura's philosophy, executives at Koei reached out to bedroom rock duo Coil to pen the songs for Gitaroo Man after hearing one of their songs on the radio. Formed in 1998, Coil is a joint venture between Sadayoshi Okamoto and Yosuke Sato, who gained notoriety for recording their music in a fully analog home studio setup, pictured here on the cover of their album Ropeland Music. The thought was that recording in analog would help give the music in Gitaroo Man a unique, almost vintage sound over its contemporaries, who were all opting to stick to a digital recording process, which was understandable given how cumbersome analog recording can be. In recording digitally, you can focus in on a section of a take where a mistake was made and correct it, but with analog, takes have to be done in one shot, like a live performance. If you play the solo flawlessly but miss a note elsewhere, the entire take has to be done over. But Coil was used to the process, and Koei encouraged them to keep to their methods as much as possible, both believing that while it was harder to pull off, analog just had more soul. And to be clear, I don't think the entire process was fully analog, as even Okamoto says his time working on the music for the game really showed him what areas analog works better and which areas digital. So it seems the recording process fully embodied the concept of fusing analog and digital, as both approaches were taken to achieve the final product. But beyond all of that, neither member of Coil had written music for a video game before, and admitted it was sometimes difficult to compose for the game as they had to make considerations they wouldn't have to in their typical songwriting process, like making charge sections of the songs or having to record both the background instrumentation and the parts performed by the player, who may or may not hit every note in the song. Add to the fact that songs in Gitaroo Man are longer or shorter depending on how well you're doing, it becomes clear just how much work they had cut out for them. But they weren't completely alone in the process, as some songs in the game were composed by Keiichi Yano's very own brother-in-law, Tomohiro Harada, who also provided all the keyboard parts in the game. It's a fairly random anecdote, but apparently the vocalist of Coil would give Harada notes on his keyboard parts, asking that they be more dog-like. And what the hell does that even mean? His own bandmate couldn't even make sense of it, which I just find really funny. My best guess is that he wanted the keys to sound like a sort of sidekick to the other parts of the song, but even that feels like a stretch. Anyway, while Harada and Coil mostly worked apart, some songs in the game were a joint collaboration, a prime example being B-Jam Blues, where even Yano himself got in on the action, performing all of the song's trumpet sections with his own electric wind instrument, which explains why Mojo King B's parts always slapped so goddamn hard. Overall, development from start to finish was completed in a staggering 10 months, which I imagine is only possible if everyone is working non-stop, round the clock for a majority of that time. All things considered, I don't think it's a stretch to say Yano and Shimomura achieved what they set out to accomplish with Gitaroo Man, especially considering they also put out a demo, Gitaroo Man 1, and a mobile game, Gitaroo Man I, ahead of the full game's release. Now, we're talking the year 2001 here, so when I say mobile game, it was really just a fancier way of downloading ringtones and wallpapers from the game. But The demo Guitar Man 1 was a neat little promo that let you play Fly Into Your Heart and a short minigame with Puma. Considering this Puma game is the only wholly unique thing about Guitar Man 1, it probably didn't take much time to assemble and release it, but when 15 people have 10 months to make a game from scratch, it's hard to imagine them devoting time to anything else. I know development crunch is nothing new in the industry, but when I read that Innes literally had to call Sony to ask them how to develop a game on the PS2, a 10-month development window seems outright miraculous. Despite the odds, they made it happen, and by June 2001, Gitaroo Man was ready to hit the stage.
PlayStation 2マキシシングル「ギタルマン1」4月5日価格の1500円でリリース。
Looking at the promotion done ahead of its Japanese release, I think it's fair to say Koei had great expectations for Gitaroo Man. They held an entire event for its initial announcement in June 2000, where the heads of Koei and the development staff talked to press about the game and who would be working on it. There's even a photo of Yukio Shimomura on stage with a cardboard replica of a Gitaru. As the release date got closer, Koei leaned into promotion, commissioning commercials for both Gitaroo Man and its demo, Gitaroo Man 1. The demo was initially marketed as a maxi single, a nod to promotional singles that bands and artists pressed onto maxi CDs, which featured extra storage capacity to allow room for additional songs and alternate takes. It was another fun way of borrowing terminology from the music industry, and a fitting name given demos and music singles essentially served the same purpose. Apparently a lot of people in Japan didn't quite get the bit, though, and the developers had to clarify on the game's official site that Gitaroo Man 1 was, in fact, a demo, and they were just being cute with their naming scheme. Guess sometimes it's a swing and a miss. They also bundled neat little playing cards with copies of the official soundtrack and demo, which featured characters from the game and allowed you to play a short round of rock, paper, scissors with a friend. There was even a brief partnership with Pentel, where select stores gave out mini Gitaroo Man figurines if you purchased lead replacements for the mechanical pencils. Because why not? Needless to say, Koei didn't hold back in rolling out the red carpet for Gitaroo Man's debut. While I can't find sales numbers for its Japanese release, seeing as Koei hasn't published a single music game since, I think it's fair to say Gitaroo Man performed below expectations. It is also backed by numerous articles and reviewers mentioning poor sales for the game. While I haven't been able to find any primary sources on that, I'm inclined to believe them. If I had to guess as to why it underperformed, it was probably because of a saturation of music games in the market by the time Gitaroo Man hit shelves in mid-2001. In the 4.5 years since Parappa, games like Beatmania and Dance Dance Revolution had taken the industry by storm, both in arcades and on home consoles. And games like Guitar Freaks and Jammer Lammy had already been out for 2 years by then, making a guitar-centric rhythm game feel like old news by the time Gitaroo Man came around. It's too bad because I feel like what works about Gitaroo Man doesn't so much come from its individual offerings, but the sum of its parts. See, when 2002 rolled around and Gitaroo Man released in the West, my generation was in the midst of Toonami's golden era, where we were being introduced to the world of anime beyond Pokemon. I don't want to act like we had nothing, especially compared to the 80s and early 90s, but it was nothing like it is today for Western fans of anime. And outside of those shows on Toonami, anime-themed games were still pretty scarce outside of JRPGs and a limited number of other niche genres. And while arcades were in their overall decline, we still had a fair number around, at least where I lived, and it didn't matter if it was some big cheese arcade or some podunk joint in the middle of a vacant strip mall. If it called itself an arcade, it had a DDR machine. I was a little too young to have played Parappa when it first came out, so I actually have to credit my introduction to rhythm games to DDR. It was something of a living room phenomenon the way Guitar Hero and Rock Band would later become in the late 2000s, where people would gather at each other's houses to play on woefully inferior plastic mats that registered your inputs maybe half the time. So when I saw Gitaroo Man for the first time, half its gameplay was already familiar to me, and the rest looked fun enough to at least try. That, combined with the anime aesthetics that us Toonami kids were starved for, made Gitaroo Man a certified It was also refreshing to see a game from Japan that wasn't severely watered down for a Western audience. Localization in those days wasn't exactly known for preserving the cultural roots and references of their material.
These donuts are great! Jelly filled are my favorite!
So to play a game like Gitaroo Man felt like a rare experience. It almost raises the question of why Koei even took the time to localize Guitar Man, especially with poor domestic sales. If I had to guess, it would be that most of the game's localization would be done through voice acting, since the story is mostly told through voiced cutscenes than text. The amount of text that was in the game wasn't all that much compared to, say, a 60-hour RPG. On top of that, Guitar Man didn't require an expensive peripheral to play, since half its gameplay relied specifically on the analog stick of the PS2 controller. A lot of rhythm games at the time were ports of arcade titles, which distinguished themselves with unique controllers that, when released for home consoles, were often required to play and jacked up the cost to consumers considerably. Given that arcades were dying out in the West and many of these peripheral-based games wouldn't be brought over, Guitar Man benefited from using a regular controller as its input method. So despite an underwhelming performance in Japan, Guitar Man was brought to the United States in February of 2002, and while it didn't sell any better here, it was well received. Critics adored it, and it even managed to amass enough of a cult following among fans to receive a reprint in 2005, just 3 years following its release, due to so few copies being initially printed by Koei. And while demand wasn't enough to grant the game a sequel, it was ported to the PSP in 2006 under the title Guitar Man Lives, which featured a new duet mode where friends could link up their copies of the game and face 2 new bosses together. Both bosses featured their own original songs, though they were only playable in duet mode as story mode was left unchanged. All in all, it's a great port of the original game and works well on a console like the PSP given its short playtime. I actually find some parts of the game easier on the PSP version, since the smaller analog stick makes aiming for the action line a little easier, though not enough to even come close to beating Master Mode. Following Guitar Man's release, Innes would go on to make Elite Beat Agents on the DS, another beloved cult classic that's yet to see a re-release, as well as several other music titles over the years, their most recent being 2016's Just Sing on the PS4 and Xbox One. While he hasn't directed any games since, Yukio Shimomura still works at Koei, most recently as a soundtrack director in 2018 for Dynasty Warriors Online. Coil is still around, though now as a solo project of Sadayoshi Okamoto, as it seems Yosuke Sato left the group in 2014. Mitsuru Nakamura is still active as well, leading numerous projects in the years since Guitar Man, including artwork for an original card game and a lovely animated short, which is available on YouTube for those who might be curious. As for Keiichi Yano, well, let's talk about 2017 for a minute. So in 2017, we nearly had the collaboration of a lifetime between Keiichi Yano and Masaya Matsura, creator of Parappa the Rapper, in the form of Project Rap Rabbit. Announced as a Kickstarter project in May of that year, Project Rap Rabbit was planned to be a story-based rhythm game centered, once again, around rap, specifically rap battling, coupled with a 16th century Japanese setting and aesthetic. Gameplay was planned to be variable, not unlike Guitar Man, where different rap styles and lyrical choices would influence the flow of rap battles. Unfortunately, due to a lack of gameplay in its initial reveal, along with unreasonably high stretch goals, the project failed to secure even a quarter of its overall goal within its fundraising period. There was talk of possibly securing funding for the project another way, but in the almost 6 years since then, no updates have surfaced on that front, putting a fairly anticlimactic end to what could have been. Such is life, I suppose. I wish I could remember who it was that made the point about original art styles aging better over time than art styles that opt for a more realistic look, but Guitar Man couldn't embody that idea better. Pairing Nakamura's unique, colorful style with that smoothed out look of the CG cutscenes really did a lot to help this game age well, or at least better than a lot of its contemporaries. And whether you have enough of a trained ear to notice the analog roots of the music, the variety of genres on offer help keep the soundtrack just as timeless as the visuals, leaving some songs stuck in your head years beyond your initial playthrough. Taken all together, it's easy to see why this game still gets so many points for style, and it earns every last one of them. It's interesting to see the differences in reception to a game like Cuphead, which sold well and based itself around a similar sense of homage and nostalgia, to a game like Guitar Man. Could it be we just weren't consuming nostalgia-laden content with the same fervor back in Guitar Man's day? Or was Guitar Man simply too close to the era it was paying homage to? Either way, it's a shame that Guitar Man's most recent version is a handheld port from 17 years ago, because It's got plenty going for it that I think modern audiences would genuinely enjoy. And seeing how much copies go for on the used market these days, it's unlikely that anyone that isn't already a dedicated fan would drop that kind of money on a copy. I know there's always emulation, but not everyone is comfortable or savvy enough to do that, leaving the game's discoverability to a much narrower subset of players. But maybe it's enough that the dozens of us who love and remember Gitaroo Man still appreciate it enough to mention it every now and again in conversation. I personally don't believe games need to be some touchstone work or sales chart juggernaut to be granted an audience to newer mainstream gamers. But I also know those kinds of decisions aren't up to me. There's probably a whole host of business-related reasons as to why not every game from the past can be ported to the current gen digital stores. And at the end of the day, this industry is a business. But seeing the interest people have for colorful, expressively animated music games as of late, I guess I'm just thinking of how perfect a time this would be for Gitaroo Man to get a fresh set of eyes on what it was trying to pull off. Who knows? Maybe we're on the cusp of a rhythm game renaissance and publishers will start to re-examine their back catalogs, granting Gitaroo Man a second shot in the spotlight. It's certainly not impossible, especially with services like the PlayStation Classics catalog, right? Right? One can only hope. Hey everybody, thanks for making it to the end of the video. Hope you found it informative and at the very least entertaining. Just want to give a quick shout out and thanks to the Guitar Pals Discord server. There's a lot of really valuable information there, really cool people, and I couldn't have done it without some of those translated interviews and just links that I couldn't find elsewhere. So big thanks to them. I'm sorry if the intro and outro seem a little detached from the whole making of documentary parts of the video. I guess I just wanted to have this video contribute a little bit to that broader conversation about long-term game preservation. So if it seemed weird or out of place, that's why. But I hope you all enjoyed it, and leave a comment if you have any suggestions for where it should go next, or if you just have anything interesting you want to say. I'll definitely be doing this again soon, so subscribe and keep an eye out for that. All right, enjoy my cat.